The candles flickered on the table, casting restless shadows on the worn wooden walls of the room. The clock on the shelf made its steady ticking sound, each tick and tock echoing in the stillness of the night. Henry Carter stood, leaning against the frost-covered window. Outside, the wind whispered softly, dragging snowflakes that piled up on the rusted fence and the slanted roof of the garage. He gazed into the emptiness, as if the darkness outside might offer answers he couldn't find within himself. The room was lit only by the candles and the colored lights of a small pine tree in the corner. The decorations were simple: cracked glass baubles, a garland that looked more like a tangle of golden wires, and a cardboard star on top of the tree. He had made the star many years ago, on a lazy afternoon, while Margaret watched him with that smile that always made his problems seem small. "It's crooked, Henry," she had said back then, laughing, but he never corrected it. The star was still crooked to this day. Henry sighed, stepping away from the window. The night felt longer than usual. He looked around the room, his eyes resting on every detail that brought memories of times gone by. The clock, a wedding gift. The china cabinet with dishes only used at Christmas. The old couch where his children, now adults and distant, used to sit to open their presents. Everything felt full of history but empty of purpose. He walked over to the dining table, where a single plate was set. The dinner was simple: bread, butter, a bowl of potato soup he had made without enthusiasm. He sat slowly, feeling the familiar creak of the chair. His eyes wandered to an old photograph in a frame on the wall. It was from a Christmas decades ago. Margaret, with her apron covered in flour, her hair tied in a bun, laughing while their two children tried to steal cookies from the oven. "You always said Christmas was about the little things, didn't you, Margaret?" he murmured, holding the edge of the plate with trembling hands. The emptiness he felt was more than just the absence of his wife. It was as though everything he had built in life had lost its meaning. He hadn't seen his children in months, maybe longer. Not even a phone call that night. He tried not to care, but couldn't stop the tightening in his chest. Suddenly, his eyes fixed on the china cabinet. There was a drawer there, locked with a small key he always carried in his pocket. He knew what was inside: documents, papers he had been putting off dealing with, but now they seemed to call to him. He slowly got up, walked over to the cabinet, and grabbed the key. When he opened the drawer, his fingers found the envelope he knew was stored there. Inside were the final instructions for something he had been wrestling with for weeks. He stood still for a moment, holding the envelope as if it weighed a ton. He looked at the small nativity scene on the shelf and whispered, "Maybe this is it. Maybe it's time to do something that really matters." A decision began to form in his mind. He didn't know exactly why, but he had the feeling that this Christmas would be different. Maybe it would be the last one where he could do something meaningful. Henry held the envelope firmly, his wrinkled fingers pressing the paper as if it contained something heavier than words. He walked back to the dining table and sat down. The candlelight cast shadows over his face, accentuating the deep wrinkles that years of hard work and longing had left. He placed the envelope on the table next to the untouched plate and stared at it. "Margaret, you always knew how to make the tough decisions," he murmured, feeling a lump in his throat. He took a deep breath and finally opened the envelope. Inside were the papers he had been avoiding, documents formalizing his decision to donate his entire inheritance. There would be nothing left for him, but it wasn't for him that it mattered. The names were listed there, carefully chosen. They weren't just his children, John and Sarah, whom he hadn't seen since last Thanksgiving, when the conversation turned to arguments about who should inherit the house. There was also an old friend, Bill, who had taken care of him when he had health issues. A nurse from the local hospital who always treated him with a smile, even on the tough days. And a small community organization that handed out meals at Christmas to those with no place to eat. He knew his decision was unconventional, maybe even crazy to many, but to him, it made sense. For years, he had accumulated wealth and savings thinking about the security of his family. However, as the years passed, he realized that the distance between them wasn't measured in miles, but in something much deeper. They never called, never visited, except when there was something to ask for. And Henry knew that, deep down, money would never buy the love he longed for. "If I can't buy their love, Maybe I can give others a chance to change their lives. This was the logic that had been supporting his decision, even when doubt hit hard on the loneliest nights. Still, a pang of fear crossed his chest. Was he doing the right thing? Would it be unfair to John and Sarah, even if they had drifted so far? He ran a hand over his face, trying to push away the whirlwind of thoughts. Margaret, if I'm wrong, forgive me, but I feel this is what I need to do. He took a pen from the drawer and looked at the blank space where his signature should go. The document was not yet finalized. The lawyer would deliver it the next morning. But to Henry, the decision felt sealed. He wanted his last contribution to the world to be something more meaningful than just leaving money to those who wouldn't appreciate his memory. Still seated, he recalled the Christmases of his youth. They weren't made of expensive gifts or lavish dinners, but of moments he still kept in his heart. The smell of gingerbread cookies coming out of the oven, the laughter shared by the fireplace, the Christmas songs echoing through the small house where he grew up. Simple moments, but full of love. That was what Christmas meant to him. He looked at the nativity scene on the shelf, the small figure of baby Jesus lying in a makeshift manger made of straw. Maybe giving what I can is the only way to truly honor what Christmas means. Henry closed the envelope again, but this time with a different feeling. It wasn't just resignation, it was purpose. He knew this decision would change everything, for better or for worse. The following morning arrived silent and cold. The pale light of the winter sun streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating the dust particles floating in the air. Henry woke up early, as he did every day, but that morning felt different. He made his usual coffee, strong, bitter, just the way he liked it, and sipped it slowly, sitting at the table, staring at the documents that had been left there overnight. Outside, the world was calm, with the snow still covering everything in a soft blanket. There were no sounds of passing cars, no children playing, no neighbors clearing their driveway. It was as if Christmas had sucked all the energy from the surroundings, leaving only emptiness. Henry knew that, in a few hours, the lawyer would come to pick up the papers. He had requested one last signature, the final gesture that would formalize his decision to donate the house and the remainder of his inheritance. Henry would spend the rest of his days in a small rented apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't ideal, but it was enough for him. After all, he never needed much. As he stirred his coffee with a spoon, he looked around the kitchen. The walls were still covered with the yellow tiles Margaret had chosen decades ago. In one of the drawers, he knew the cookie cutters the kids loved to use when they were small were still there. Everything in that house had a story, a memory that seemed to scream in his mind, begging to be preserved. And who will remember all this? He asked aloud, though he wasn't expecting an answer. He knew John and Sarah didn't care. They never mentioned the house or the objects. To them, it was all just a pile of old things with no real value. But to Henry, it was different. It was more than a house. It was the place where he and Margaret built a life. It was where they raised their children, where they laughed, cried, and faced the ups and downs together. And now, he felt like he was saying goodbye to it all at once. Henry's internal conflict was clear. Part of him wanted to believe he was doing the right thing, but another part questioned himself. Was he wrong to leave all of this to strangers and organizations, while his own children would be left with so little? In the end, would they understand his reasons, or would they hate him for it? As he reflected, the sound of footsteps outside caught his attention. Henry stood up, walked to the door, and opened it to find his neighbor, Sam, holding a snow shovel. Sam was a young man in his 30s who always offered to clear Henry's driveway on snowy days. "Good morning, Mr. Carter. I thought I'd stop by and clear your driveway before I head to work," Sam said with a friendly smile. "Thanks, Sam. You're always so helpful," Henry replied, nodding his head. As Sam began to work, Henry stood by the door, watching him. It was curious how Sam, a neighbor he barely knew, seemed to care more about him than his own family did. The young man's kindness made him question his decision even more. Maybe that's what really mattered. Small acts of kindness that kept people connected. But the doubt still lingered. When Sam finished and waved at him before leaving, Henry returned to the kitchen table and sat down again. He looked at the documents and, for the first time, felt the pen in his hand weigh heavier than ever before. "Margaret," he whispered, almost like a prayer, I'm doing the right thing, aren't I? The doorbell rang exactly at 10 a.m. Henry was sitting in the armchair in the living room, holding a cup of already cold tea. He glanced at the clock on the wall and sighed. "It's time," he murmured, slowly standing up, feeling his joints protest with the effort. When he opened the door, he found the lawyer, a tall and thin man named Peter Wallace, who had handled many of Henry's legal matters over the years. Peter carried a black briefcase and a polite smile. His suit seemed out of place in the humble, cozy environment of the house, as if he were a piece from a different puzzle. "Good morning, Mr. Carter. I hope you had a good night," Peter said, extending his hand. Henry shook the lawyer's hand firmly, but without saying much. "Come in. It's cold out there." They sat at the kitchen table, the papers spread out over the wooden surface that already showed signs of wear. Peter began explaining what would be done, his voice professional but distant, while Henry stared intently at the signature he had already practiced so many times. "So, once we sign this, the transfer will be effective. All the beneficiaries will be notified, and your inheritance will officially be donated as per your instructions." Henry nodded, but there was something in Peter's tone that bothered him. He seemed too cold, as if the situation was just another routine task. "Peter, let me ask you something," Henry began, interrupting the lawyer. "Do you think I'm making a mistake?" The lawyer hesitated. It was clear he hadn't expected that question. He adjusted his glasses and replied carefully, "My job is to make sure your decisions are executed according to your will, Mr. Carter. But if you want my opinion, it's an unusual choice. I don't see many cases like yours." "Unusual," Henry repeated, as if savoring the word. He knew his decision wasn't conventional, but hearing it from someone else brought an unexpected discomfort. "You're doing something generous, no doubt. But generosity isn't always understood, especially by those who expect something different." Peter's words echoed in Henry's mind as he held the pen, ready to sign. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the emotional weight of the moment. He thought of his children, John and Sarah, and how they would react when they found out. He thought of the silence that always filled the days after their rare visits. He thought of Margaret and what she would have said if she had been there. But just before he could sign, something unexpected happened. The sound of the doorbell rang again, interrupting the moment. Henry looked at Peter, who seemed just as surprised as he was. "Are you expecting someone else?" the lawyer asked. Henry shook his head, his brow furrowed. He slowly stood up and went to the door. When he opened it, he found an unfamiliar man, dressed simply, with a worn coat and an intense gaze that seemed to pierce Henry, as if trying to read his soul. "Mr. Carter?" the man asked, his voice firm but polite. "That's me. How can I help you?" The man took an envelope out of his coat pocket and handed it to Henry. "My name is Michael. This letter is from your brother." Henry froze. The word brother hung in the air like an impending storm. His brother, Thomas, whom he hadn't spoken to in over 40 years. The envelope seemed to vibrate in his hands, as if it were alive. "There must be some mistake," Henry said, his voice unsteady. "My brother, he wouldn't reach out to me. He's no longer a part of my life." Michael just shook his head. "I assure you, there's no mistake. He asked me to deliver this personally, today, because he knew it would be important." Henry slowly closed the door, not even properly saying goodbye. He returned to the kitchen, holding the envelope as if it were both fragile and dangerous at the same time. Peter watched him with curiosity, but didn't ask any questions. "Looks like today's a day for surprises," Henry murmured as he sat back down at the table. He placed the envelope next to the donation papers and stared at both, trying to decide where to begin. Henry stood still for a few minutes, staring at the two envelopes in front of him. The first contained the formalization of his decision to donate everything he had, the final step of a plan he had been nurturing for months. The second seemed to have appeared as a provocation from fate, a letter from someone he hadn't seen in over 40 years, his brother Thomas, with whom the memories were more tied to hurts than to happy moments. Peter cleared his throat, bringing Henry back to reality. "It's fine if you need more time to decide, Mr. Carter. I can come back later." But Henry shook his head. He knew that if he kept putting it off, doubt would grow like a shadow, suffocating the clarity he thought he had reached. "No, Peter. Let's finish this now. It's the right thing to do." He picked up the pen and signed each page with precise movements, but one's heavy with emotion. With each signature, he felt as if he were leaving a part of himself on the paper. When he was done, he pushed the documents toward the lawyer and dropped the pen, which rolled across the table and fell to the floor, echoing in the silence of the house. Peter collected the papers and organized everything with the efficiency Henry expected from someone so accustomed to bureaucracy. "It's done. I'll contact you once everything is processed." He hesitated for a moment, as if he wanted to say something more, but ended up just nodding before leaving. When the door closed, the silence in the house seemed louder than ever. Henry looked at the remaining envelope, the letter from his brother, and felt a tightness in his chest. The decision he had just made was supposed to be liberating, but he felt an emptiness greater than before. He had believed that by giving everything he had, he would be leaving behind the ties of the past, but now it felt like the past was determined to find him no matter what. He picked up the envelope with hesitant hands and slowly opened it, as if unearthing something long forgotten. Inside was a sheet of paper with careful handwriting, the same handwriting of Thomas, firm and meticulous, as if every letter had been planned with precision. "Henry, if you're reading this, it means something I left unfinished is finally reaching you. I know it's been decades since we last spoke, and I don't expect you to forgive me for everything that happened. But there's something you need to know, something I never had the courage to say before. On the night we had our last fight, I took something from you, something that should have been yours. I've carried that guilt for years, but I never had the courage to face you. Now, with my health failing and time running out, I can't keep holding on to this. Please, look for the attachment at the end of this letter. It will explain everything." Henry stopped reading for a moment, his mind spinning in a confusion of thoughts and memories. He remembered the last night he saw Thomas, how the bitter words had echoed through their parents' house. At the time, he had thought the reason for the fight was money, a trivial matter of dividing their parents' estate. But now, it seemed there was something deeper hidden in that night. He turned the paper over and found the attachment mentioned, a yellowed piece of an official document. As he read it, his eyes widened, and his breath caught in his chest. What was in front of him was not just a revelation. It was a secret that changed everything. Henry let the paper fall onto the table and put his head in his hands. He had made a decision he thought was final, but now he felt that the very foundation of his choice was being questioned. He looked at the small nativity scene on the shelf, as if expecting to find answers there. "Margaret," he murmured, his voice choking. "Why now?" The night was long and sleepless. Henry spent hours sitting at the table, staring at the papers spread out before him. Thomas's letter seemed to radiate something almost tangible, as if it were alive, waiting for him to take action. The secret it revealed, something Henry was still trying to process, had become a new, overwhelming weight, and the decision he thought had been final now seemed terribly hasty. When the sun rose, Henry rose from the chair with a heavy body. He made coffee, but couldn't bring himself to drink it. His hands trembled when he tried to lift the cup, so he gave up and stood still in the kitchen, looking out the frosted window. The morning silence was broken only by the distant sound of a car passing on the street, a subtle reminder that the world outside was continuing its course, while his seemed to have stopped. He returned to the living room, where the nativity scene remained undisturbed on the shelf. The small figure of baby Jesus in the manger seemed to stare at him, as if demanding something he wasn't ready to give. Margaret always said the nativity scene was the heart of the house at Christmas. It's a reminder that even the greatest blessings come from the simplest circumstances, she used to say. But now, it seemed more like a reminder that he had lost control of his own life. The unexpected ring of the doorbell made Henry jump. He looked at the clock. It was still early. Who could it be? Carefully, he walked to the door and opened it, finding Sam again, the young neighbor who seemed determined to care for Henry in a way no one else did. "Mr. Carter, I hope I'm not bothering you so early. I was clearing the snow from my sidewalk and thought I'd bring this to you." In Sam's hands was a small tray covered with aluminum foil. When Henry accepted it, the warm, comforting aroma of cinnamon and apple rose to his nose. They were homemade cookies, exactly like the ones Margaret used to make every year at Christmas. I know Christmas can be a little lonely sometimes, Sam said with a shy smile. So I thought you might want some company. If you don't mind, of course. For a moment, Henry was speechless. He looked at Sam, and the sincerity on the young man's face brought a lump to his throat. Thank you, Sam. Come in, please. It's cold out there. Sam stepped inside, bringing with him a little warmth and energy that the house had been missing. They sat in the living room, and Henry, without thinking too much, began to talk. He told Sam about Thomas's letter, about the secret it contained, and how it had changed everything. It's strange, Henry said, looking at the fire he had lit in the fireplace. I spent years thinking I knew everything about my family, about what they wanted and what I should do. But now I feel like I don't know anything at all. Sam listened attentively, without interrupting. When Henry finished, the young man leaned forward, hands clasped together. Mr. Carter, my mom always said that Christmas has a way of bringing out what we most need to face, even when we're not ready. Maybe this letter isn't a burden, but a chance. Henry looked at Sam, his words echoing in his mind. A chance. It was hard to see the letter that way, but he couldn't deny that there was something transformative in its arrival. After Sam left, leaving the tray of cookies on the table, Henry picked up the letter again. The yellowed piece of paper seemed even more fragile in the daylight, but what was written on it carried an enormous weight. Thomas's secret wasn't just about money or material goods, but something deeply personal, something that redefined the very roots of the inheritance Henry had just donated. He looked at the donation papers, now out of his hands, and felt a chill run through him. What if I rushed into this? What if this letter is what I needed to truly understand what to do? Henry picked up the phone. There was a call he needed to make, but not to the lawyer. He dialed Sarah's number, his eldest daughter, whom he hadn't heard from in months. The phone rang several times before going to voicemail. Henry didn't leave a message. He tried John's number, but the result was the same. Hanging up the phone, Henry felt a deep emptiness. Maybe the truth isn't about what I can give them, but what they're ready to accept. He looked at the tray of cookies, and for the first time that day, he felt warmth, as if a small spark of hope had ignited. The afternoon passed slowly as Henry remained trapped in his thoughts. Thomas's letter was still on the table, open like an exposed wound. He read and reread the words, trying to make sense of them. The phrase, "I took something from you," something that should have been yours, echoed like a drum in his mind. It was impossible to ignore the weight of those words. The phone sat beside him, but Henry didn't have the courage to dial another number. After the failed attempts to reach his children earlier that morning, he felt even more isolated. They hadn't answered, and he knew that even if they had, the responses might have been cold or rushed. But this time, it wasn't just about them. Thomas's letter revealed a piece of history Henry had never known, something that affected more than his inheritance. He needed answers. With that in mind, Henry opened an old box that had been stored in the living room closet. Inside were photo albums, old letters, and forgotten documents. He began rummaging through it all, hoping to find some clue that would connect Thomas's words to what he knew about his own story. Each photograph was a journey into the past. His childhood on a humble farm, moments with Thomas, and the marriage to Margaret, who had always been his safe harbor. But the more he looked, the more he realized that his relationship with his brother had always been marked by distance and distrust. Even in the good times, there was something unsaid between them. As he flipped through the photos, one in particular caught his attention. It was a portrait of his entire family, taken in front of the old house where they grew up. His parents were in the center, with Henry and Thomas on either side. But there was another person in the photo, a young woman he didn't immediately recognize. She was in the background, almost out of frame, with a somewhat shy but affectionate look. "Who is she?" Henry whispered to himself, frowning. He searched the back of the photo and found a handwritten note. Jane, summer of 1958. The name didn't ring any bells. He knew his parents had hired help on the farm, but he had never heard of anyone named Jane. A disturbing thought began to form in his mind. Could this woman be connected to Thomas's secret? And, more importantly, why had no one ever talked about her? Determined to understand, Henry grabbed his coat, wrapped a scarf around his neck, and left the house. He knew he had to start somewhere, and the most obvious place was the small town archive, where old records were kept. The snow creaked under his feet as he walked through the nearly deserted streets, the cold air biting at his cheeks. When he arrived at the archive, he was greeted by a middle-aged woman named Martha, who vaguely remembered Henry. "Mr. Carter, right? How can I help you?" Henry quickly explained that he was looking for records about his family, specifically from the time when Jane was connected to the farm. Martha nodded and disappeared behind a counter, returning a few minutes later with a stack of aged files. As Henry flipped through the papers, a piece of history began to emerge. There were mentions of Jane as a young woman who had worked on the farm for a few years, but one document stood out. It was a birth certificate. He read the document several times, as if the words could change if he looked hard enough. The mother's name, Jane. The father's name, unknown, but the name of the child was familiar. Henry froze, his heart racing. The letters on the certificate were clear. Thomas Carter. "My God," he whispered, his hands trembling. He couldn't understand everything yet, but he knew he had just uncovered something deeply buried. The truth seemed bigger and more complicated than he had imagined. As he put the papers away, Henry felt the weight of the revelation. Thomas wasn't who he thought he was. The history of his family was far more complex, and this shed new light on what to do next. "Margaret, what would you have done if you were here?" he asked the empty space as he walked home, each step heavier than the last. Back at the house, Henry closed the door behind him with a weight that seemed heavier than anything he had ever carried. He placed the papers carefully on the table, next to Thomas's letter, and sat down, resting his elbows on the worn surface. His hands covered his face as he tried to process everything he had discovered that afternoon. Thomas wasn't his parents' legitimate child. The revelation brought a torrent of conflicting emotions: surprise, anger, pity, and a deep confusion. Everything he thought he knew about the dynamics of his family seemed to crumble. Childhood memories began to surface more clearly, as if long-forgotten details now made more sense. He remembered how Thomas always seemed distant, even at the best of times. There was always a sense that he didn't fully belong, but Henry had never known why. Now, he understood. Thomas must have carried this truth alone, living as a stranger within his own family. "Why didn't he ever tell me?" Henry murmured, looking at the small pile of papers before him. Why carry this for so long? But as the sadness for Thomas grew in his heart, another emotion crept in: guilt. He thought of the years of distance between them, the insults exchanged the last time they saw each other, and the hasty decision he had made about his inheritance. Had he given everything away, including the house and the remnants of his own history, without even considering what Thomas might need? This thought gnawed at him. He stood up, began pacing around the room. The space that once felt cozy now seemed tight, suffocating. He stopped in front of the nativity scene again, looking at the manger and the figures of Joseph and Mary. They had to raise a child who wasn't biologically theirs, Henry thought, almost laughing at the irony. But the reflection didn't bring comfort. It only reinforced the feeling that he had missed the opportunity to understand what truly mattered before making his decision. He picked up the phone again, this time hesitating before dialing. He wanted to talk to someone, anyone, who could offer clarity or even just listen. But the numbers he had dialed before still weighed on his mind. His children, John and Sarah, who had ignored his calls. Their distance now seemed part of a bigger pattern, a reflection of the family failures he was starting to see more clearly. Henry put the phone back in its cradle and sat down again. Doubts began to grow like a storm. He wondered if Thomas, knowing all of this, might have taken something from him that fateful night, not out of greed, but out of desperation. Did he feel like he had no right to anything? That he had to take what wouldn't be given freely? Maybe it was an attempt to find his place, Henry thought, his throat tight. But then, another doubt arose, more personal and painful. Was Henry repeating the cycle of exclusion and neglect, ignoring what Thomas really needed from him? He had signed the papers to donate his inheritance, thinking he was doing something noble, but now he began to wonder. Was it an act of kindness, or a way of giving up on his own family? The internal conflict was almost unbearable. On one side, the certainty that his children didn't appreciate what he had to offer. On the other, the possibility that Thomas, the brother he had avoided for years, might have been trying to find redemption with that last gesture. The room seemed to spin around him as Henry suddenly stood up, unable to stay still. He opened the front door and stepped out into the cold night air. The snow had stopped falling, but the wind was still sharp, bringing with it the scent of pine trees and the distant sound of Christmas bells. He looked up at the sky, where the stars shone against the darkness like small beacons. "Margaret, you always knew what to do. Why is this so hard for me?" he asked, as if the night could answer. But all he heard was the wind. The next morning, Henry woke up with a new determination. The discovery about Thomas and the growing doubt about his decision to donate his inheritance had kept him restless during the night, but it also sparked something inside him, the need to act before it was too late. The clock read just past 7 when he picked up the phone and dialed the number of his lawyer, Peter Wallace. This time, the call was answered almost immediately, with Peter's voice sounding formal and slightly surprised. "Good morning, Mr. Carter. How can I help you?" Henry took a deep breath before responding. "Peter, I need your help. I want to suspend the documents I signed yesterday. Something has come up, and I need more time." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Henry could imagine the lawyer furrowing his brow, pondering the situation. "Mr. Carter, I understand your concern, but the documents are already in the process of being executed. I can try to contact the beneficiaries and the responsible offices, but, to be frank, reversing everything might not be simple, especially if the parties involved have already been notified." Peter's words hit him like a bucket of cold water, but Henry didn't give up. "Then do whatever it takes, Peter. I don't care what it costs. I just need time to understand things better. There are things I didn't know, important things. I'll see what I can do, Mr. Carter. But as I said, there are no guarantees." "Thank you, Peter. I'll wait for your call." After hanging up, Henry sat back at the table again, feeling the weight of uncertainties. Peter's voice, professional and practical, didn't offer the comfort he had hoped for. He knew he had created a complicated knot, and undoing it wouldn't be simple. As he looked out the window, the phone rang again. He answered quickly, thinking it was Peter with an immediate response, but the voice on the other end wasn't the lawyer's. "Henry, it's Sarah." Henry's heart raced upon hearing his daughter's voice. It had been months since they last spoke, and she sounded distant, as always. "Sarah, what a surprise. I was trying to talk to you yesterday. Yes, I saw the calls, but I was busy. I heard from John about the donation you made. Is it true, Dad? Did you really donate everything, even the house?" Henry hesitated. He felt a pang in his chest as he realized that Sarah's tone wasn't one of concern, but of disbelief, almost anger. "Sarah, I did what I thought was right at the time. But now, I'm rethinking some things." "Rethinking?" She let out a dry laugh. "Dad, do you know what this means for us? For me and John? We work hard, we have our families, and you just decide to give everything to strangers? How do you think that makes us feel?" The harshness in Sarah's words made Henry close his eyes for a moment, as if he needed strength to respond. "Sarah, try to understand. It's not about you or me. I wanted to do something meaningful, something beyond money. But maybe I acted too quickly." "Meaningful? Dad, your family is meaningful. Or at least it should be." The silence between them was deafening. Henry could feel the weight of Sarah's resentment, but he also knew that the connection between them had been strained for a long time. He wanted to tell her about Thomas, about the letter, about everything he had discovered, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. "Sarah, I just want you to know that I'm trying to fix things. Maybe we can talk more later, when things are clearer." She sighed, and he could hear the frustration in her voice. "Of course, Dad. I hope you know what you're doing." When the call ended, Henry put the phone back in the cradle and ran a hand over his face. The conversation with Sarah left him even more unsettled. He knew his relationship with his children was in ruins, but now it seemed like every step he took only deepened the distance between them. Still, there was something he needed to do. He stood up, grabbed Thomas's envelope, and began reading it again. Each word seemed heavier, more loaded with implications. If Thomas had kept this secret for so long, Why had he chosen this moment to reveal it? Suddenly, Henry had an idea. He needed answers directly from Thomas, not just from his words in a letter. But finding his brother after all this time seemed impossible. Or maybe not. He knew of a place where he could start. The house where they grew up. Henry grabbed his coat and went out again, the cold wind biting his face as he walked through the snow-covered streets. It was time to go back to the past, where all the answers seemed to be waiting for him, even though he wasn't ready to face them. Henry's childhood home was about an hour away, out in the rural area of town. The drive was quiet, only the sound of the taxi's engine filling the emptiness as Henry gazed out the window at the snow-covered landscape. Each tree and curve in the road seemed loaded with memories he preferred to keep buried, but something inside him pushed him to keep going. If Thomas chose this moment to reveal his secret, then maybe this house had something to say too. When the taxi finally stopped, Henry got out slowly, as if he were stepping onto sacred ground. The house looked smaller than he remembered, almost fragile, with loose shingles and peeling paint exposing the weathered wood. Even so, it was still standing, a silent testament to the generations that had passed through it. He stood still for a moment, staring at the porch where he and Thomas used to play during the endless summers of their childhood. It was strange how that place, once full of laughter and movement, now seemed so empty. Taking a deep breath, Henry walked up to the door and knocked. To his surprise, it was Michael, the man who had delivered Thomas's letter, who answered the door. The man's face lit up when he saw him. "Mr. Carter, I thought you would come. Please, come in. You knew I was coming?" Henry asked as he crossed the threshold, feeling the familiar smell of aged wood mixed with something faintly medicinal. Michael nodded. "Thomas mentioned that you might need to come here. He's in the bedroom, but his health is very fragile. He asked me to explain a few things before you see him." Henry furrowed his brow. "Fragile? What do you mean? What's happening to him?" Michael gestured for Henry to sit in the living room. He began speaking with measured calm, almost as if he had rehearsed what to say. "Thomas is ill, Mr. Carter. Advanced cancer. He doesn't have much time." He knew this when he wrote the letter. The words hit Henry like a blow to the stomach. He sat in silence, absorbing the news. That's why Thomas had reached out now, after all this time. He was racing against the clock. "And what else does he want me to know?" Henry asked, his voice hoarse. Michael picked up an old photo album from a nearby table and handed it to Henry. "He wanted you to see this before speaking to him." With trembling hands, Henry opened the album. The first photos were familiar. Him and Thomas's children, their parents in front of the house. But as he turned the page, he found images he had never seen before. There was a photo of Jane, the young woman from the farm, holding a baby in her arms. The baby had light brown hair and eyes that Henry instantly recognized as Thomas's. "My God," Henry murmured, staring at the image. Michael confirmed what the photo had already suggested. Jane was Thomas's mother. "Your parents hired her to work on the farm when she was pregnant. They decided to raise him as their own to protect her. It was a tough time, and a single mother suffered a lot of prejudice." Henry turned another page and found a handwritten letter, signed by his mother. It was addressed to Jane, full of words of gratitude for entrusting them with Thomas's care. But there was also something else, a promise that the truth would be told one day. "But they never told me," Henry said, feeling the weight of the revelation. Michael nodded. "They thought it was for Thomas's good. But the last time you two argued, he told me he carried the truth like a burden, and that, in the heat of the fight, he took something he thought you would never value as much as he did." Henry looked at Michael, his eyes full of questions. "What did he take?" Michael hesitated before answering. "A deed. The deed to a small piece of property your parents left behind. He believed that, since he wasn't their legitimate child, that was the only tie he could claim as his. He kept it for years, but now he wants you to have it back." Henry closed the album and looked around the room, feeling the walls closing in on him. The entire dynamic he thought he understood about his family was crumbling. But more than the confusion, there was a deep sadness. Thomas had spent his whole life feeling like an imposter in his own family, and Henry had never realized. "Can I see him?" Henry asked, standing up. Michael nodded and led Henry to the bedroom. where Thomas's frail figure lay on an old bed, wrapped in blankets. When Henry entered, Thomas's gaze met his, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The room was immersed in silence, broken only by the sound of the wind outside and the soft hum of a small heater in the corner. Thomas, lying in the bed, seemed even smaller than Henry remembered. His face, marked by time and illness, was both familiar and distant. His eyes, however, still carried that intensity Henry had always associated with his younger brother, even during their most heated arguments. Henry stood still at the door for a few seconds, unsure how to begin. Their entire lives had been marked by an invisible wall they never knew how to break down. Now, that wall seemed unnecessary and foolish, but the right words still wouldn't come. "Thomas," Henry finally said, his voice low and hoarse. Thomas opened his eyes and tried to smile, but the gesture was interrupted by a coughing fit that left him gasping for air. Michael, who had been in the hallway, quickly appeared with a glass of water and then left to give them the privacy they needed. "You came," Thomas said, his voice weak, but clear enough to carry a mix of surprise and relief. "I read your letter, and I saw the album," Henry replied, moving closer to the bed. He pulled up a nearby chair and sat down, feeling the weight of the moment. "Why didn't you tell me? Why carry this alone for so long?" Thomas looked away, as if searching for the words somewhere on the ceiling. "Pride, maybe. Fear. I didn't know how you'd react, or if it really mattered to you." "It mattered," Henry said immediately, his voice stronger than he expected. "It always mattered, even if I didn't know it. Thomas, I spent decades thinking I understood our story, but it seems like I never knew half of it." His brother let out a brief, tired laugh. "You think I knew? I spent half my life trying to piece it all together. I didn't even know Jane was my mother until I found that letter after our parents died. And in that moment, it felt like my whole life had been a lie. When we fought that night, all of that exploded. It was easier to pull away than face you, or face myself." Henry felt a lump tighten in his throat. He wanted to apologize, but the words seemed insufficient. He looked at Thomas's hands, now thin and fragile, and thought of all the times he could have reached out but didn't. "You took the deed," Henry said, changing the subject, not out of lack of interest, but because he needed to fully understand. "Why was that so important to you?" Thomas looked at him, his eyes shining with a mix of guilt and determination. "Because I needed something that was mine, something that connected me to this family. The property wasn't worth much, but to me, it was proof that I belonged here. I convinced myself that you'd never miss it, but even so, I never had the courage to use it. It stayed hidden, like a secret I didn't know how to return. Thomas, you always belonged. It was never about documents or property. You were my brother, even when we didn't understand each other." The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was as if they were both processing the decades of distance and pain that had built up between them. Henry finally broke the silence. "I made a mistake, Thomas. I gave everything away. The house, the money. I thought I was doing something noble, but I think I was running from the truth about myself, about my family." Thomas looked at him for a moment before speaking, his voice even softer. "It wasn't a mistake, Henry. At least, not completely. You've always had a good heart, even when it was lost sometimes. Don't blame yourself for trying to do what you thought was right." Henry felt his eyes water, but he quickly blinked, trying to hold back the tears. "I don't want things to end like this, Thomas. I don't want you to feel like a stranger in this family. And I want to do whatever I can to fix this." "Then do it," Thomas replied, smiling faintly. "It's not too late. Not for you." The conversation went on for a while longer, with the two brothers revisiting childhood memories and sharing stories that had, until that moment, stayed buried. When Henry finally stood up to leave, he felt something different. It was as if a part of him, one he hadn't even known was lost, had been restored. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said at the door. Thomas nodded, a look of gratitude in his eyes. "I'll be waiting." As Henry walked back through the snow, he felt the burden he had carried for so many years begin to lighten. He still didn't know how to fix everything, but for the first time in a long time, he believed it was possible. The following day dawned gray, with heavy clouds covering the sky and promising more snow. Henry had returned home after his conversation with Thomas the night before, but the weight of the revelations and the desire to correct his mistakes still tormented him. He spent hours at the kitchen table, staring at the papers representing the donation he had hastily formalized. Now, everything seemed more complicated. The phone rang late in the morning, and he answered with a growing nervousness. It was Peter, the lawyer. "Mr. Carter, I have an update on your request to suspend the documents," Peter began, his voice professional as always. "So, what's the update? Did you manage to reverse the process?" "Partially," Peter said, with a hesitation that immediately made Henry's heart race. "The cash funds and investments have already been transferred to the beneficiaries, but the house hasn't been fully processed yet. I have a window of time to pause that item, but I'll need your final confirmation by tomorrow morning." Henry felt a mix of relief and despair. He still had a chance to keep the house, but the rest of his inheritance was already out of his control. "Thank you, Peter. I need to think." After hanging up, Henry stood up from the table, pacing back and forth across the room. The house was the heart of everything he knew, the place where his story began, and it now seemed more vital than ever, especially after his conversation with Thomas. But at the same time, he wondered, would fighting to keep it really solve anything? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. When he opened it, he found Sarah, his eldest daughter, standing on the porch. She was dressed in a heavy coat and a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, but her eyes conveyed something colder than the weather. "Dad," she said, her tone direct. "Can we talk?" Henry motioned for her to come in, feeling a mix of surprise and apprehension. He hadn't expected to see her so soon, especially after their tense phone conversation. When Sarah sat down on the couch, she went straight to the point. "I can't understand, Dad. Why did you think it was a good idea to donate everything? You knew it would affect us, that it would complicate our lives. I can't stop thinking that you just gave up on us." Henry felt a lump in his throat. He knew he needed to defend himself, but he also knew Sarah was partly right. "Sarah, it wasn't about giving up. It was about trying to do something good, something that meant something. I thought I was doing the right thing, and he hesitated before continuing. "I didn't know how to fix what was wrong between us. I thought maybe giving space and focusing on something else could bring some peace." Sarah shook her head, frustrated. "Dad, we're your family. John and we might have our flaws, but you didn't even try to include us. You just decided we weren't part of it." Henry looked at her, realizing that there was more behind Sarah's words than anger. There was hurt, maybe even guilt. He took a deep breath before responding. "And you and John? When was the last time you came here because you wanted to, not because you needed something? When was the last time we sat together to do something other than argue about money or property?" "Sarah, I made mistakes, but I wasn't the only one." The silence that followed was heavy, but Sarah finally looked away, recognizing the truth in those words. "I know," she said, almost whispering, "but that doesn't mean we want to lose you. Not everything can be fixed with money or gifts, but giving up on us doesn't help either." Henry felt her words cut deep, touching a point he had been avoiding. Maybe, without realizing it, he had been giving up, not just on his belongings, but on his ability to reconnect with his children. "You're right," he finally said, "and that's why I'm trying to reverse what I did. Not everything, because some things I still believe were right. But I want to keep the house, Sarah, not just for me, but because it's what's left of who we are, who we were." Sarah's eyes softened, and she nodded. "Then do it, Dad. But this time, do it with us. Not for us, but with us." When Sarah left, Henry felt a spark of hope ignite. The conversation had been difficult, but maybe it was the first step towards something different. He picked up the phone and dialed Peter again, making it clear the house would not be donated. Now, there was one more thing to do. Finish what he had started with Thomas. The next morning, Henry found himself back at his childhood home. This time, he knew that this place was not just a backdrop for distant memories, but the stage of a story he was still uncovering. When he entered Thomas's room, he found his brother awake, with a faint but genuine smile. "I knew you'd come back," Thomas said, his voice soft. Henry sat down next to the bed, feeling the weight of the moment. There was so much that needed to be said, but he didn't know where to begin. Finally, he pulled out a small envelope he had brought from home. Inside, there was a photo of the nativity scene on the shelf in his living room. "Do you remember this?" Henry asked, showing the picture. Thomas smiled. "Of course. Mom loved that nativity set. I remember how she always insisted it was more than just a decoration. She said it was a symbol of hope. I never understood how right she was until now," Henry said. "But now I see that this nativity was always there to remind us of what really matters. Not money, not property, but family. Even when it's complicated." Thomas nodded, his eyes filled with something Henry couldn't quite identify. Maybe regret, maybe acceptance. "I should have told you before. I should have trusted you." Henry took his brother's hand, feeling how cold and fragile it was. "You did what you thought was right at the time, Thomas. But now it's time to leave that behind. I'm here. No matter what happened before, you've always been my brother. And you always will be." Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, as if those words were a relief he'd been waiting for years. When he opened them again, there was a spark of determination in his gaze. "There's something else you need to know, Henry." Thomas gestured for Michael, who had been in the hallway, to enter the room. He was carrying a small wooden box, which he handed to Henry. "It's all here. Everything I've kept over the years. Jane's letters, the property deed, even some things our parents hid from us." Henry opened the box carefully, revealing a treasure trove of memories and secrets. There were letters full of love and regret from Jane, explaining how she had entrusted Henry's parents to raise Thomas. Among the documents, Henry found something unexpected: an old handwritten will, dated before their parents' death. As he read, his heart raced. The document divided the family's assets equally between Henry and Thomas, regardless of any blood ties. It was clear proof that their parents had always considered Thomas a full member of the family, even if they had never said so openly. "They wanted you to know, but they were afraid of how it would affect all of us," Thomas said, his voice weak. "I kept this for so long because I thought you wouldn't understand. And maybe because I didn't understand it myself." Henry felt the tears fall as he held the will. He looked at Thomas, realizing that the weight of this secret had eaten away at his brother his entire life. "Thomas, none of this matters now. What matters is that we're here. The rest are just papers. You've always been better at dealing with these things, Henry," Thomas said, with a tired smile. "But thank you for listening. Thank you for forgiving me." "I need your forgiveness too," Henry replied, "for the years we lost, for the times I let my pride get in the way. Let's fix this while we still have time." The two brothers continued talking, with Henry delving deeper into the stories and secrets that Thomas was finally willing to share. When Henry left the house that afternoon, taking the box with him, he felt that for the first time in years, he was truly free. He knew there were still challenges ahead: reconnecting with his children, adjusting the consequences of his decisions regarding the inheritance, and finding a way to honor both Thomas and the legacy of his family. But above all, he felt that something important had changed. It was the beginning of a new chapter, and this time, he was determined to write a different story. The next morning, Henry found himself back at his childhood home. This time, he knew that the place wasn't just a backdrop for distant memories, but the stage for a story he was still discovering. When he entered Thomas's room, he found his brother awake, with a weak but genuine smile. "I knew you'd come back," Thomas said, his voice soft. Henry sat down next to the bed, feeling the weight of the moment. There was so much that needed to be said, but he didn't know where to begin. Finally, he pulled out a small envelope he had brought from home. Inside was a photo of the nativity scene on the shelf in his living room. "Do you remember this?" Henry asked, showing the picture. Thomas smiled. "Of course. Mom loved that nativity set. I remember how she always insisted it was more than just a decoration. She said it was a symbol of hope. I never understood how right she was until now," Henry said. "But now I see that this nativity was always there to remind us of what really matters. Not money, not property, but family. Even when it's complicated." Thomas nodded, his eyes filled with something Henry couldn't quite identify. Maybe regret, maybe acceptance. I should have told you before. I should have trusted you. Henry took his brother's hand, feeling how cold and fragile it was. You did what you thought was right at the time, Thomas. But now it's time to leave that behind. I'm here. No matter what happened before, you've always been my brother. And you always will be. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, as if those words were a relief he'd been waiting for years. When he opened them again, there was a spark of determination in his gaze. There's something else you need to know, Henry. Thomas gestured for Michael, who had been in the hallway, to enter the room. He was carrying a small wooden box, which he handed to Henry. It's all here. Everything I've kept over the years. Jane's letters, the property deed, even some things our parents hid from us. Henry opened the box carefully, revealing a treasure trove of memories and secrets. There were letters full of love and regret from Jane, explaining how she had entrusted Henry's parents to raise Thomas. Among the documents, Henry found something unexpected, an old handwritten will dated before their parents' death. As he read, his heart raced. The document divided the family's assets equally between Henry and Thomas, regardless of any blood ties. It was clear proof that their parents had always considered Thomas a full member of the family, even if they had never said so openly. They wanted you to know, but they were afraid of how it would affect all of us, Thomas said, his voice weak. I kept this for so long because I thought you wouldn't understand. And maybe because I didn't understand it myself. Henry felt the tears fall as he held the will. He looked at Thomas, realizing that the weight of this secret had eaten away at his brother his entire life. Thomas, none of this matters now. What matters is that we're here. The rest are just papers. You've always been better at dealing with these things, Henry, Thomas said, with a tired smile. But thank you for listening. Thank you for forgiving me. I need your forgiveness too, Henry replied, for the years we lost, for the times I let my pride get in the way. Let's fix this while we still have time. The two brothers continued talking, with Henry delving deeper into the stories and secrets that Thomas was finally willing to share. When Henry left the house that afternoon, taking the box with him, he felt that for the first time in years, he was truly free. He knew there were still challenges ahead, reconnecting with his children, adjusting the consequences of his decisions regarding the inheritance, and finding a way to honor both Thomas and the legacy of his family. But above all, he felt that something important had changed. It was the beginning of a new chapter, and this time, he was determined to write a different story. Henry returned home that night with a lighter heart, but his mind still restless. The conversation with John had been a significant step, but it wasn't the end of the journey. He knew there was still much to be done, both with his children and with Thomas, whose time seemed to be running out. Upon entering the living room, Henry turned on the lamp next to the armchair and looked at the nativity scene on the shelf. That small scene, so familiar, seemed to have gained a new meaning. Each figure, every detail, represented something deeper than he had ever realized. Joseph, Mary, and the baby Jesus were not just characters in an ancient story. They symbolized the power of sacrifice, forgiveness, and, above all, unity in the face of adversity. He walked over to the shelf, took the crooked star from the top of the nativity, and held it in his hands. It was a simple object, made of cardboard and glitter, but it carried memories of past Christmases, times when the family was together, and the house echoed with laughter and songs. Margaret, I think I finally understand what you always meant about Christmas, he murmured, looking at the star. It's not about what we leave behind or what we accumulate. It's about who we choose to carry with us. Sitting at the kitchen table, Henry opened Thomas's small box once again. As he ran his fingers over the letters and photos, he began organizing his thoughts. There was much to do, but for the first time, he felt he had a plan, a clear direction. First, he needed to fix what he could regarding the inheritance. Keeping the house was the beginning, but he also wanted to make sure Thomas's memory was preserved, especially now that he knew the full truth. Maybe the small property mentioned in the documents could be turned into something meaningful, something that represented Thomas's journey and the silent love of his parents. Second, he needed to find a way to reconnect with Sarah and John, not just through words, but through actions. He thought of the past Christmases, the simple moments that had been so important, yet he had set aside for so many years. An idea began to form in his mind. Henry picked up the phone and called Sarah. It was late, but he felt he couldn't wait. To his surprise, she answered quickly. "Dad, is everything okay?" "Yes, Sarah, everything's fine. I just wanted to say thank you for yesterday. It meant a lot to me." Sarah was silent for a moment before responding. "It meant a lot to me too, Dad. Maybe more than I realized at the time." "I wanted to ask something," Henry said. "I want you and John to come to the house for Christmas. It doesn't have to be anything big, just the three of us. Maybe Thomas too, if he's well enough. I want us to have a real Christmas, like we used to." Sarah hesitated, but her response brought an unexpected warmth to Henry's heart. "I'll talk to John, but I think we can do that. It'll be good, Dad." When the call ended, Henry felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. He knew there was still much to be done, but for the first time in a long time, he believed Christmas could bring not just reconciliation, but a new beginning. As he looked at the nativity star, Henry decided it wouldn't be crooked anymore. He grabbed some glue and carefully adjusted the sides, shaping it until it was straight. When he finished, he smiled to himself. It wasn't perfect, but now it looked ready to shine again. Christmas morning arrived with a clear sky and a light layer of snow covering the garden. Henry woke up early, his heart anxious and full of expectations. For the first time in years, he didn't feel weighed down by the past or the uncertainties of the future. He had something concrete to look forward to: a reunion with his family, something he knew would be difficult but necessary. In the living room, he carefully arranged the nativity scene. The star, now fixed, shone under the lights of the small tree beside it. In the kitchen, he was preparing a recipe he hadn't made in decades: the gingerbread cookies Margaret used to bake with the children. The sweet, slightly spicy smell filled the house, bringing memories of simpler times. At 10 in the morning, the doorbell rang. Henry wiped his hands on the apron and went to the door. When he opened it, he saw Sarah and John standing there, each holding small gift bags. Sarah smiled, a little awkwardly, while John looked a bit out of place, but still, they were there. "Merry Christmas, Dad," Sarah said, entering and giving him a hug. "Merry Christmas," John added, hesitating before also hugging Henry. "Merry Christmas, my children. Come in, come in." As they settled in, Henry noticed something different. It wasn't just their presence that warmed the house, but a sense that, despite everything, there was a path they could walk together. Later, the doorbell rang again. It was Michael, helping Thomas inside. His brother looked frighlier than ever, but there was something in his expression that Henry hadn't seen in years: peace. "Merry Christmas, Henry," Thomas said as he was helped into an armchair near the fireplace. "Merry Christmas, Thomas. I'm glad you're here." The family gathered around the table, where Henry had placed the cookies and a pie that Sarah had brought. During the meal, there were moments of awkward silence, but also shy laughter, shared memories, and even a few jokes that made John visibly relax. Finally, when everyone seemed more at ease, Henry stood up, holding a piece of paper. He cleared his throat before speaking. "I know this year hasn't been easy. I made choices that probably confused and hurt you. But today, I want to start fixing that. I want this Christmas to be the beginning of something new for us." He looked at Thomas, who nodded with a small smile of encouragement. "I want to share something I discovered about our family, about our past. It's not just Thomas's story, but our story, the one that connects us and defines us. Because, in the end, it's not what we inherit in material things that matters, but what we inherit in love, in understanding, and in moments like this." Henry briefly told the story of Jane, the letters, and the will he had found in the box. He didn't go into too many heavy details, but he was honest enough for Sarah and John to understand the impact of it all. "And that's why I want to dedicate this house to something more than old memories. I want it to be a place where we can build new memories. Not just for me, but for you, and even for those who come after us. A place where we can always remember what really matters." Sarah and John sat in silence, processing what they were hearing. Thomas, across the table, looked at Henry with eyes shining. "You finally understood, brother," Thomas said softly, but firmly. John was the first to speak. I didn't know there was so much about our family I was ignoring. I guess none of us knew. But, Dad, if you want this to be a new beginning, I want it too. Sarah nodded, discreetly wiping away a tear. Me too. We can do this together, Dad. Henry smiled, feeling the tears well up in his own eyes. He raised an impromptu toast with the glass of juice in his hand. To our future. May it be as sweet as these memories we're starting to create today. Everyone raised their glasses, and the room was filled with a lightness that Henry hadn't felt in decades. Later, when everyone was leaving, Thomas held Henry's hand a little longer than usual. Thank you, Henry, for not giving up. Henry squeezed his brother's hand tightly. Thank you for giving me a chance, Thomas. As the Christmas lights blinked in the empty room and the scent of gingerbread still lingered in the air, Henry sat in the armchair, looking at the nativity scene. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be perfect, but in that moment, everything seemed to be exactly where it was meant to be. On Christmas night, after everyone had left, Henry sat alone in the living room, in the armchair by the fireplace. The glow of the tree lights reflected in his eyes as he held the photo album he had taken from Thomas's box. The pages were worn, but the pictures told stories he was just beginning to understand. He ran his fingers over an old photo. He and Thomas, still children, sitting on the porch bench at the farmhouse, both smiling, covered in dirt, but clearly happy. Henry couldn't remember the exact moment when their bond had started to fade, but now he felt a weight heavier than ever for the distance he had allowed to grow between them. How many Christmases did I waste? He murmured, closing the album and looking at the nativity scene on the shelf. He slowly got up, walked to the window, and watched the streetlights blinking in a nearly hypnotic rhythm. The town seemed peaceful, wrapped in the calm of the night. For a moment, a wave of vulnerability hit him. Despite the progress made with his family that day, he still felt the shadow of past mistakes lingering over him. He thought of Margaret, the way she always knew what to say, what to do. I should have been more like you, he whispered. His voice choked, but then, something within him shifted. He realized that simply acknowledging his mistakes was already a significant step. He had faced his own flaws, made peace with his brother, and started rebuilding the bonds with his children. And in that moment, he realized that triumph wasn't about erasing the past, but accepting that it was part of who he was. Henry looked back at the nativity scene and, in a symbolic gesture, took the small figure of Joseph and held it in his hands. He remembered how Joseph had taken on the responsibility of caring for something bigger than himself, even without all the answers. I can do that too, he said quietly. I can start over too. He returned to the armchair, feeling lighter than he had in the past weeks. He picked up the phone and dialed Sarah's number. She answered almost immediately. Hi, Dad. Is everything okay? Yes, it is. I just wanted to thank you again for today. It was a special day. It really was, Dad. John and I were talking about how you seemed different, more present. Henry smiled. I think I finally understand what really matters, Sarah, and I want you to know that I'm here. For you, for us. We're here too, Dad, she replied, with a sweetness Henry hadn't heard in years. After hanging up, Henry stared at the phone for a moment. The house was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the emptiness it used to be, but a pause, an opportunity. When he finally turned off the lights and went upstairs to bed, Henry felt like he had achieved something that once seemed impossible: peace. He knew there was still work to be done, but he was ready to face it. The next morning, when the first rays of sunlight came through the window, illuminating the nativity scene and the tree, Henry woke up with new determination. He was no longer just a man dealing with the weight of his decisions. He was someone who chose to start again. The next morning, Henry woke up early, with an energy he hadn't felt in a long time. The sun shone through the curtains, casting a warm glow in the living room. He went down the stairs and headed straight for the kitchen, where he began preparing a special breakfast. It was something Margaret used to make in the days after Christmas. Pancakes topped with honey and fresh fruit, a simple ritual, but full of meaning. As he set the table, the sweet smell of pancakes filled the house, bringing memories of years past. But this time, those memories didn't leave him feeling melancholic. Instead, he felt grateful to carry them with him while creating new moments. Shortly after, the doorbell rang. He opened the door and saw Sarah and John again, this time without any prior notice. Sarah was holding a bottle of orange juice, and John carried a small stack of plates that seemed to have been hastily put together. "We decided to come back for breakfast," Sarah said with a smile. "I hope there's still some left," John added, trying to sound casual, but with a sparkle of affection in his eyes. Come in," Henry said, feeling his chest warm with the surprise. They sat at the table, and Henry served the pancakes while they chatted. The atmosphere was relaxed, full of small laughs and stories that flowed naturally. Henry noticed something different, a lightness in their interaction, as if the barriers that once existed were beginning to fade. After they finished eating, Sarah suggested something that caught Henry by surprise. "Dad, John and I were thinking, maybe we could spend more time together from now on. Not just at Christmas, but at other times too." Henry paused for a moment, trying to absorb the words. He looked at his children, and for the first time in a long while, he felt that they weren't just saying it out of obligation. There was sincerity in their words, and it touched Henry deeply. "I would love that," he replied, his voice slightly choked. "More than you know." When Sarah and John left, Henry stood at the door, watching them walk through the snow to the car. He waved as they left, feeling that something inside him had finally shifted. Later that afternoon, Henry received another unexpected visit. It was Michael, who had come to bring news about Thomas. "He wanted you to know that the property documents he kept are ready to be delivered. But more than that, he asked me to tell you that he's never felt as at peace as he did yesterday." Henry smiled, feeling a weight dissolve in his chest. "Thank you, Michael, for everything." When Michael left, Henry stood at the door for a moment, breathing in the cold air and smelling the distant scent of burning wood from the neighborhood fireplaces. He went back inside and picked up the small nativity scene once again. Now, he knew he didn't need to carry the weight of trying to fix everything all at once. Each gesture, each conversation, was a step, and he was willing to take those steps, no matter how long it took. He placed the nativity scene in the center of the shelf and, with a smile on his face, sat down in the armchair. The star on top of the tree softly gleamed, and the house, for the first time in years, seemed full of life again. As Henry sat in his armchair, watching the room filled with lights and memories, an idea began to form in his mind. He glanced toward the kitchen, where the tray of cookies he had made the day before still rested on the table. Next to it were Margaret's recipes, lovingly kept in a worn notebook, filled with handwritten notes. He picked up the notebook, flipping through its yellowed pages. Each recipe had a story, a memory attached to it. The gingerbread cookies Margaret made with the kids on Christmas Eve, the fruit cake that was always a hit at dinner with friends, and the apple pie that was served as dessert at nearly every special occasion. Henry stopped on a specific page, the cinnamon and nutmeg cake recipe, Thomas's favorite. He remembered how his brother always said the smell of that cake was the true sign that Christmas had arrived. A smile formed on his face as he thought, these recipes aren't just food. They're memories. They're what bind us, even when we're far apart. It was then that he realized this might be the way to share what he had learned. He could gather these recipes, these stories, and use them to help other families find what he had almost lost: connection, love, and shared moments. Henry stood up, went to his desk, and grabbed paper and pen. He began to write down an idea that had long been tucked away in some corner of his mind, but now seemed as clear as the shine of the star on top of the tree. A small book that would gather these recipes and the memories they brought. He jotted down the title, Sweet Christmas Memories, Simple Recipes to Warm the Soul. As he wrote, he felt an energy he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just about him or his family, but about how these small traditions could bring warmth and togetherness to so many other people. Henry knew he wasn't a writer, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the message. Christmas is made of simple moments, and it is these moments that sustain us, even in the hardest times. By the end of the afternoon, he picked up the phone again and called Sarah. "Hi, Dad," she answered, a slight surprise in her voice. "Sarah, I had an idea, and I want to know what you think. How about we gather your mom's recipes in a book? Not just the recipes, but the stories behind them. Something to keep these memories alive and, who knows, help other families create special moments too." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a soft laugh. I think that's a wonderful idea, Dad. And you won't be doing this alone. John and I will help. Henry felt his heart warm at her words. Thank you, Sarah. That means so much to me. As he hung up, he looked again at the recipe notebook and imagined what it would be like to share these pieces of his life with the world. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was truly leaving a legacy, something that connected the past, present, and future in one single message. That night, as Henry sat at the table with a cup of hot tea, he reflected on everything he had learned. He realized that Christmas had never been about grand gestures or expensive gifts. It was about the simple moments, the smell of cookies in the oven, an honest conversation, or the glow of a crooked star on top of a tree. He looked around the room, which now felt full of life and meaning. Every small tradition, once forgotten, now represented an opportunity for reconnection, love, and the creation of memories that would last forever. And now, you, who are here, also have this opportunity. Think about what makes Christmas special for you. Maybe it's the taste of a recipe your grandmother used to make, or a tradition your family lost over the years. What would happen if you could bring that back? This is the perfect moment to revive the magic and warmth that make Christmas so special. That's why we created the ebook Sweet Christmas Memories. Simple recipes to warm the soul, a guide full of simple, yet powerful recipes to create delicious memories and unforgettable moments with your family. The recipes are easy to follow, perfect for preparing together. Whether it's cookies that remind you of childhood or desserts that will shine on the Christmas table. But it's not just about food. It's about reclaiming what really matters, the time we spend together. The link to get your copy is pinned in the comment below. Don't let Christmas pass by unnoticed. Start today creating moments your family will treasure forever. Because the true gift of Christmas doesn't come in boxes. It's made of memories.